All right, so I should, okay.
Hey friends, welcome. This is week 35 of gathering together around God's Word. And today we are going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke and the Q Gospel. And Paul Clark's going to lead us through that. And so I'll turn it over to him. But before I do that real quick, the Minor Prophets podcast, the second one, is available now. And the podcast on Matthew and Mark will be coming out this following week. All righty. Thanks, Paul. You're up.
All right. Thank you. I don't know if y'all remember a character actor years ago. His name was Jack Elam. He played in some of James Garner's movies, Support Your Local Sheriff, movies like that. And Jack Elam was on Johnny Carson one night, and he said there have been 4 stages to my career. He said, first, when I had an agent and everything, he said, but it was always a problem with who is Jack Elam. And he said, then it became, get me Jack Elam. And then later on, though, he said it was get me a young Jack Elam. And then the 4th stage was, who is Jack Elam? So when Will sent out this email, I'm sure that a lot of the 4th stage of my career was, who is Paul Clark? He said that Paul Clark going to teach a class. So at any rate, here we go. I'm going to proceed rather hurriedly through the first part of these notes because I hope you've had a chance to read them. If you have not, I hope you will avail yourself of an opportunity to read these notes because there's some information in here that is good information, but it's not particularly pertinent to the points that we need to make today. But one of the things that I did want to do starting out was to, as we go through these Gospels, to set the stage for the conditions that existed during the time that these Gospels were written. And as I pointed out in the notes, in many respects, there were some things that were conducive to having these books documented and available for us to read today. And I gave one example that is not pertinent to that particular, but is a good point, that it's important as we go through these Gospels to see them in the context of a people that were living at the time under the oppression of the Roman Empire. And so the hardships and the actual horrors that were inflicted upon these people by the Romans are something that needs to be taken into consideration as we read through them. I talked in another class years ago about the invention of the codex form of transcribing information. This was tremendous, and it was taking place right at Jesus' time and the few decades that followed him. There was a great transformation from the using of scrolls to capture information to the actual ability to print information, to transcribe information onto pages that could be put into books, which could be turned, that could be written on the front and the back, that could be bound. You didn't have to start off at the front and work your way through. You could go to sections in there. And so this was a tremendous advantage to transcribing these Gospels and other books that were of that particular time. So there was a prolific explosion of books at the codex system. And we're going to talk about some of that today when we talk about the Q Gospel. It will seem, if we look at that, it will seem like, well, it's not very strange that there was a book that perhaps was never found. It's not anything to be concerned that, well, you mean there was another book out there, because there were plenty of books out there. The third element, of course, that influenced this was that there was the Hellenization of the Jewish community that was taking place. More people were learning to read and write. More people were learning to teach others from written material rather than just from recollection. So the literacy factor and the socialization and cultural aspects of the Greek culture coming on to these people was tremendously important and reflected in these Gospels. You take the Gospel of Luke that we talked about a little bit today, beautifully written, beautiful composition, and that influence was what enabled that to take place. We talked a little bit about dating some of these gospels. I mentioned in the notes that the first gospels that were recorded, that are known to have been recorded, were some of Paul's letters, original letters, which probably date to some 30 years after the crucifixion of Christ. And I talked a little bit in the notes about how all of these books eventually worked themselves into being produced as a canon, as what we call the 27 books. And we're talking about the New Testament now, the 27 books of the New Testament. And that was well up into the 4th century when that took place, because there was not a tremendous amount of debate and conflict about which books would become part of the canon, but they were traditionally the books that had been in use for a long time, but they were not officially adopted as the New Testament canon until late in the 4th century. And I mentioned that let's see, was the 27 books that were reaffirmed as canonical at the synods of Hippo, Regis, and Carthage, dated all the way up to 397. And there had been, I was going to just mention briefly, there had been, previous to the adoption of the New Testament, 27 books that comprise the New Testament canon, there had been another canon that had been published and was being passed around, that had been produced by someone named Marcion. Marcion was a person who, I think he was born about 80, which would have been 50 years after Christ's crucifixion, something like that. He was the son of the bishop of Synoptic, which I think that's the way you pronounce it, which was a seaport town in southern Turkey. And he had some unusual ideas. He was a Christian and a devout follower of Paul. So he had some ideas about what should comprise the New Testament. So he published it. And you can go on Amazon today and say first canon, and you can buy a copy of Marcion's New Testament. It only had 11 books. It had the book of Luke, and that's why I mentioned it. He had heavily redacted, and we've heard that word a few times in the last few days. So he had heavily redacted the book of Luke, but it had Luke and then some of Paul's epistles, the ones that are actually attributed to being authored by Paul. So it was only 11 books in it, but I looked it up on Amazon the other day, so it was for sale. It's a book that is sold on Amazon. It's Marcion, but Marcion had one particular theory or belief as a theologian, and he was a dedicated theologian. That he had one idea that caused him problems with the other bishops, and that is that he had in his mind that the God of the Old Testament was such a bad person and wanted to inflict so much judgment and pain on people, and was not, he didn't perceive him as being evil, but he just perceived him as being a different character completely from the character of the God that would give us Jesus Christ. He said, this is incompatible. The God that is depicted in the Old Testament is not the same God that would give us the God of love and compassion in Jesus Christ. So he said, he deducted that there must be two gods. And so there is an evil God, and he's the God that actually created the earth and so forth. He's the God that's talked about in Genesis, but he's not the God that came later. So obviously, this one thing alone, although Marcion was he was a devout Pauline follower, he thought that everything Paul said was truly the gospel. But he was disqualified, if you will, on that one point about there being two gods. So the acceptance of what eventually became the New Testament canon. I used to think of this as, oh, you mean there were a lot of debates on, but really the books that were ultimately chosen, the 27 books, were probably the same books that we would choose today. They really have stood the test of time in looking at them as being what I put down here, the 3 or 4 things that seem to be the ingredients to going into why they were chosen for the canon. The apostolic origin they were attributed to are based on the preaching and teaching of the first generation apostles. And then universal acceptance. They were acknowledged by all major Christian communities by the end of the 4th century. A consistency of message, which they had, and a consistency of use. So the ones that were ultimately worked their way in to be accepted as the 27 books of the New Testament canon fit those criteria pretty well. And so I think that today, if we didn't have a New Testament and we were setting about to make one, it would probably be pretty darn close to those 27 books. I don't know of it myself, I'm not a scholar, but I don't know of any that I would add. I know of one that I would delete, but I'm not going to tell you what, well, I will. And so each of us may have a book or two that, well, I don't think I would put that one in there if I had to start over. But for the most part, the 27 books have stood the test of time as being representative of these 4 factors. And I wanted to move on, though, to say that there were a ton of apocryphal books during this time also. Books that were not in the New Testament canon. Books that were being passed around, written by different people. Most of them, though, would disqualify themselves if we applied this criteria that we just talked about. But there were plenty of books out there. And that's going to lead us in a minute up to talking about the Q Gospel. These non-canonical books, I won't try to say that word one more time today. They were sometimes used for teaching. The bishops would approve them as suitable for teaching. However, they would make the distinction that they are not legitimately part of our New Testament canon. So they were not all books as thought of as being bad. And I gave some examples of those books that were of some of the ones that were used for teaching and were thought and are still today respected as somewhat legitimate theology in what they contain. I won't go into any of these or mention any of them particularly, except I wanted to mention one, which is the Gospel of Thomas, and tell a little story about how the Gospel of Thomas was discovered. In 1945, this is an interesting story. In 1945, in Egypt, in a small peasant community near the Nile River, northeast Egypt, there were 2 brothers who were going out to dig for fertilizer. There was a place that they had found that near some caves that if you dig down, you could get some real rich dirt, what we would call composted type dirt. And they would get that and take it back and put on their crop. So these 2 brothers were digging away, and they hit with their mattock, they hit a huge earthen jar, a jar of this size, this dimension. And they hit it, and they looked at it, and they couldn't figure out, of course, what it was. And they said, well, let's just bust it open. But then they said, no, wait a minute, it may have evil spirits in it. So they held off for a while. They reconsidered and said, but it also may have gold in it. So they were persuaded to hit it with the mattock and break it open. And what came out was a whole bunch of these codices that I talked about earlier, these books. And so they were obviously disappointed. They weren't looking for books. So they took these books back to their house and kept them and put them over by the fireplace And the wife of one of them acknowledged later that once in a while she would use one of them as kindling, that she would start the fire with it, but so they didn't really have them all. But later on, there was an antiquities merchant from Cairo that got wind of the fact that these people had found these documents, and he came to look at them, and he sort of suspected they might have significant value, and one thing led to another, and eventually they sort of got scattered around. Some of them ended up in the Netherlands, some of them ended up in Germany, but before it was realized exactly the significance of this archaeological find. It turns out that there was 62 books there that they retrieved. No, Lord knows how many they didn't say, because the wife said that she had used some of them for kindling in the fire. One of the reasons that the brother, I was telling Donna this the other day, and she said, well, maybe you shouldn't tell that. But one of the reasons that these brothers were reluctant to tell anybody about this, and when people started wanting, these document experts wanted to come to their house and sort of look at what they had, they were reluctant because they had recently avenged the death of their father by hunting down his killer and hacking him to death and cutting his heart out and eating it. So they were highly suspected of criminal activity, as you can imagine, and so they were not looking for any publicity. So they sort of sat on these documents for a very long time. So that's just a side story about a little bit about.
Hey, Paul, a little quick PS to that. Supposedly they got in that jar because at some point they were using it and they were afraid that there were some bishops coming or something and they were going to find them to be heretical and that they needed to get them out of the monastery or wherever it was. And so go hide the books. Second part is, but pre-COVID, not too far before pre-COVID, some guys came to John and said, we'd like to rent the church or use a church for a wedding. Our church isn't big enough, and we haven't done well down the street with the Baptists and the Methodists or whatever. And he said, oh, yeah, okay, well, and what's your church? The Church of Thomas. And he said, the Church of Thomas? He said, yeah, you know, Thomas, hello. And so they've had 2 weddings here. And as he's going to show them the sanctuary, as they're getting ready to go in, he says to step in, and they went, you don't take your shoes off? So that they always take their shoes off at their church, everyone. Church of Thomas.
Yeah, these books were dated to have been written somewhere around maybe the 1st of the 4th century. They were written in Egyptian Coptic, but they were obviously, some of them were old enough that they had been translated from Greek. So there was, to get to the Gospel of Thomas, which is in this book right here, you work yourself backwards from Coptic back to Greek to get the book as it's published today. So I went on then in the notes to move on and just some random depictions of books that are not in existence but have been referred to in the Gospels, or there's a lot of them in the Old Testament. I named a few that's been referred to in the New Testament. Books that we know that existed but have been lost. And so there's nothing mysterious about this. It would stand to reason that books were lost. Paul refers to a couple of instances where I had sent you a previous letter. Well, we don't have that letter, but if we did, it would be a precious commodity, obviously. I know when we read through Matthew, one of my impressions of the book of Matthew is that Matthew is just dead set on convincing us that Jesus is the Messiah that is predicted in the Old Testament. He is the one that was foretold to be the coming Messiah. So what he does is always adds, or does a lot of times, at least 15 or 20 times, he will add to his comment as prophesied in Scripture, or words to that effect. So in one instance, he did that. He says in Matthew 2:23, he said, he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So Matthew says that, but there's nowhere in the Bible that it says that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. So someone could say, well, there is a book somewhere that says that he's called a Nazarene. We just don't have it. So that's just an example of what I'm talking about here, where it says, where Paul may use the expression, thus it is written, and refer to something. Paul says, thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam being a life-giving spirit, and so forth. So I want to move on then, but all I'm doing here is just building the thought process that to have a book that is lost, or to have a book that no one, that maybe we only have fragments of, at least, and we don't really know its content, that's nothing unusual. So I want to move on to talk about the Q gospel because of its significance. I want you to go to this sheet here now. Look at the relationships between the Synoptic Gospel. They are. When we look at the books of Luke and Matthew, there are 235 verses in Luke and Matthew that are essentially the same. Sometimes these verses have a little bit of difference. Sometimes the story that they tell, the narrative part of what these gospel writers are telling, varies a little bit. Yeah, but the essential essence of what they're saying is the same. So there are 235 parallel verses. So for a long time, not recently, but at least 200 years, biblical scholars have figured out that there is a lost source for this information that both Luke and Matthew seem to have, and the same stories that they told, the same parables, and the same narrative stories about Jesus' life. So if you look at your chart, it shows not only the implication of the Q gospel on Luke and Matthew, but it also shows the triple tradition of how much of Mark is also shared by Luke and Matthew. And sometimes this chart has been a little bit confusing because of these percentages. They seem to vary. But if you, just as an example, if you look at that chart, you will see that let's just say that in the purple it says 76%. That means that 76% of Mark is shared. 76% of the book of Mark is shared with these other two gospels. But when you move over to Luke, since Luke is a much larger book, it's at least a third larger in its composition than the book of Mark. It only comprises 41% of Luke. And for Matthew, which is about the same size of a book as Luke, is 45%. So that is what's called the triple tradition. In other words, Mark, the stories and the narrative and the parables and all of the Jesus' teachings from Mark are shared by Luke and Matthew to the extent that it comprises, in the case of Luke, 41% of Luke, and in the case of Matthew, 45%. So that's the way. Do you all understand any question about how that works? Because it's sometimes I remember when we went over this a few years ago, there was a little bit of confusion about some of these percentages. But you also then, the double tradition, which would be right in the middle, in the bottom here, is what we're talking about a little bit today, is the Q gospel, the gospel that has come to be known as the Q gospel, shows that there is 23% of the book of Luke and 25%, which is almost the same, of the book of Matthew is shared stories, shared material. They're telling the same thing. They're telling the same parables and so forth. So that is what leads us into the conclusion that there is a book that they use for this source that we don't have. And if that is true, and most scholars feel that it is, then what a precious book that would be, because it would be a very, very early gospel. It would be and as time has gone on, more and more scholars have come to believe that the Q gospel may contain a lot more than just this part that's in Luke and Matthew common. There could be, we see here that 35% of the book of Luke is unique to Luke. That means it's not in Mark. It's things that is not in Mark or not in Matthew. So it's unique to Luke. But some of that could also be in the Q gospel. It would just mean that same information that was from the Q gospel in Luke was not something that Matthew chose to put in Matthew. So it's not common to both of them. So the Q gospel here has moved from being thought of as just a book of sayings to actually having narrative content, to having stories in it, just like the other gospels do. And then to having not only Jesus' teachings, his parables, his healings, and so forth, but actually the story of his life, his birth, his upbringing, his trial, his death, and his resurrection. So the Q gospel has become in many people's minds as much richer and full of more content than it was originally thought of, just assigning to the Q gospel just the common material between these two. Some of the Q gospel precedes perhaps even the book of Mark, which is earlier than Luke and Matthew, but it certainly precedes Luke and Matthew. If it precedes them, then it's a book that is probably from Jesus' time in and around his preaching in Galilee, when he first started his ministry. And so this would be very, very good, early, good, rich material, and we would all be blessed by it if we had a copy of it. Some of the things that are in it, we know that would be in the Q gospel are the Beatitudes, the Golden Rule, the Lord's Prayer, and then many and many of the parables, the parable of the blind leading the blind, the parable of leaven, and so forth. I did make put a note in here that not every Bible scholar in the world believes that there was, in fact, a Q gospel. Some scholars have used other ways of trying to explain how this common material could have gotten in here without there being a lost book, and so it's not something that there doesn't have its detractors. I want to move on now. Are there any questions or comments about the Q?
Are you saying the Q is explaining the double tradition between Matthew and Luke? Or
Yes. Yes, that's exactly.
So what about the other double traditions, like between Mark and Luke and Mark and Matthew? Are they part of the Q, or are they part of something else, or is that a different concept?
Well, in other words, it is thought that Mark was the first gospel, that Luke and Matthew had Mark available to them.
Oh, all right.
But they also had the Q gospel available to them.
I got it. Okay.
So, Mark's gospel doesn't have anything about Jesus' birth and where it was from and all of that. It just jumps right into his ministry, more or less, at the time of John the Baptist and the baptism. And so it's a much shorter book. So this material that works its way into Luke and Matthew that probably came out of the Q gospel, a lot of it is narrative material. And the story of Jesus being born in Bethlehem, for example, is depicted in both Luke and Matthew. a little bit different. It's a good example of a story that each one tells, but they don't tell it exactly the same way. They don't tell exactly that Jesus, why he was born in Bethlehem in exactly the circumstances. But those are irrelevant totally in terms of studying these two gospels. I want to move on to talk a little bit about the Gospel of Luke, and I think according to what Will tells me, this today sort of launches the study of Luke, and so I certainly hope to read Luke again. And it's a rather long gospel, but I said earlier, I think it's, as far as the richness of it and the way that it's written and the eloquence with which things are depicted in Luke, it certainly turns out to be a lot of people's favorite gospel. But Luke is the gospel that starts to break us away from Jesus just being the Messiah for the Jews. And Luke wants to start to bring Jesus into that he is the Christ and the Savior for everyone, for all people, for Gentiles as well as Jews. So a lot of that is what we read in Luke. I made a note that I'm going to touch on just very briefly, but and there may not be anyone here that particularly agrees with these points, but I made a point in my notes to say that I think as we read through these Gospels, it is a little bit important to sort of place them in terms of time, which were first, which may have followed 20, 30, 40 years later, and we get a sort of idea of what the change might have been, the gradual change in the feeling about things. So I made that I believe, and I just, what prompted me to mention that was is my just commenting that Luke brings us into the Gentile phase of Jesus' ministry, and that he was for all people rather than just the Jews. But I think as you read through this gospel, you may detect, as I think I have, that gradually as they move on, there is a sort of an anti-Judaism that starts to develop more and more. The Jews become more and more responsible in the way for the crucifixion of Jesus. They were, in Luke, Pilate says, "I find no fault with him," But back in Mark, it was more that it was the Romans. But later on, we get to the final point that is sort of laid at the feet of the Jewish people. And so, anti-Judaism is not a dead thing. It's as live today as it was almost at this particular time. I made a second point. I won't elaborate on it, but I also believe that there's a change in the presentation of who Christ was as we gradually work our way through these Gospels, that he becomes less and less of a human figure and more of a divine figure as we move forward. Not to comment on that any further. I've made a third point, and Marcia may disagree or agree, but I think that I believe the role of women in the Christian movement gradually diminished in the first 200 years after Christ. Once Paul's ministry to the outlying areas and the Gentile areas, and then pulling back from that and having to set up a structure for administrating these areas that he had brought Christianity to by the establishment of some sort of a church hierarchy and some sort of a structure to keep the message clear and to keep people from backsliding, if you will. The bishops became named, and they had quite a bit of authority and power, and so it became to be, at least from my perspective, a more male-dominated thing than it was during, say, for example, when Mark's gospel is depicted in Mark's gospel, or it's depicted in some of the other early gospels. So I think there again, that sort of stuck with us a little bit. You know, look at really. I mean, read what it says in Timothy compared to looking back, as I said here, to how it describes the role of women in discovering that Jesus had vanished from the tomb and so forth. The significant role that women had throughout the Bible, and some of the courses that Marcia's taught, she has talked about that a lot. So I talked about that Luke's gospel is known as the gospel of inclusiveness. His mission is to highlight the universal scope of Jesus' message, and to includes those that are outside the historic nation of Israel. So he says in chapter 2, verse 10, the message of the angels to the shepherds in the Judean fields is that Christ's coming is good news and great joy, which will be for all people. What time is it? About 20 till?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to move a little bit faster because there's an area that I want to spend just a little bit of time on. I want to talk about the other emphasis in Luke as being a prophet. Luke will continually depict Jesus as a prophet, and he will give examples of that. He will give examples of how Jesus fits the same role that some of the prophets in the Old Testament. And I gave the example of the widow of Nain as a story that Luke tells about Jesus, that he says, look, he really is a prophet. So, but I wanted to go to another subject in our last few minutes. That last week, Mary Beth raised, Mary Beth's not here, I don't believe, but she raised a question that I thought that was really worth of some further amplification. And she was talking about some of the hard verses in the Bible. Some what have sort of become known as hard verses. They're just verses that we say, gosh, how do we deal with that? What do we make of this? You know. And so what we were talking about was talking about suffering and so forth, and to the extent that we are intended to suffer also and be sacrificial in our lives, just as Jesus was. And some of these verses are very, very difficult. They're difficult to deal with. It's whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will save it. So that's right out of Luke, what we're talking about today. I thought that her question was good, and I thought that Will's response was just excellent, because it seems to me that one of the things that stands out so much in Luke is sort of a key to maybe the answer to this, and that is as we look, well, what is our role? What are we supposed to do? How, Simone Weil, the French mystic, she said that every time I think of the crucifixion of Jesus, I commit the sin of envy, because she had thought that her role would be, if she had the opportunity, she would die on the cross. She would be willing to die on the cross. In fact, she was envious of Jesus being able to do that instead of herself. Well, I think the way that we need to look at it, in my opinion, is that we are called, I think, to be compassionate, first of all. And I think that compassion in Luke, it just stands out to me over and over and over again. I think there are maybe 20 or 30 verses that actually use the word compassion. It's not, there are other versions that may say mercy. He had mercy on them, but the use of the word compassion, to me, is significant in the Bible. And I asked Sybil if she would read a couple verses. These particular verses happen to be from Matthew instead of Luke, but they just go to the heart of what I think Jesus' message was and what he's calling us to do. And would you read those?
Sure. Matthew 20:30-34. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet. But they shouted all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped and called them. "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. And in Matthew 8:1-4, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. Then a leper came to Jesus, begging on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and the man was cleansed.
Yeah, I particularly love that last verse. That I was thinking the other day, if Pastor Hall would preach a sermon on just those 3 words, "I am willing." I am willing. He said, if you were willing, you could help me. And he said, I am willing. And I would walk a long many miles to hear that sermon.
You're doing fine.
So, the reason for showing Jesus compassion, Paul says, where did I have in 2 Corinthians, he said, "Praise be to God and Father, our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our trouble so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves receive from God." So there's the whole message right there. The compassion that we see Jesus showing over and over and over again is supposed to work through us so that we can be compassionate of others. And the way, to the extent that goes, as Will said last week, it varies for each of us. But, and some of us are called to maybe perhaps more than others. But we are called, I think, to the edge of using a term that my dear father used to use, and he used it with the wrong definition, because there's a word called disfurnish. And disfurnish means, if you look it up on the web, it just means to get rid of stuff, disfurnish. But he didn't use it that way. He used it in the way that if the neighbor brought him a bucket of apples, and he'd say, "These are for you, John," my dad would say, "Don't disfurnish yourself." What that means is, don't give me so many apples that you don't have enough. Well, that's the way he used that his whole life. Don't disfurnish yourself. If you offered him anything, he would often say that. But I think that we're really called by the gospel to disfurnish ourselves a little. And unless we're disfurnishing ourselves, I don't think we've gone quite far enough. We need to be, as best we can, the best version of ourselves. And the best version of ourselves is, in this day and age, is really, we don't see it a lot as much as we need to. Pastor Hall mentioned last week that even in the Christian community, it seems like a lot of people are looking for an excuse not to be the best version of themselves. They are being told that it's all right to be anti-Semitic. There's somebody, Donna, I think, flashed on her phone this morning that there were Nazi flags being displayed in St. Petersburg last night. So
On the bridge.
on the bridge. So I think we're called to be a better version of ourselves, and I think that goes beyond us as individuals, and it goes into our church needs to be a better version of itself. Our community needs to be a better version of ourselves. Our nation needs to certainly be a better version of ourselves. I was looking at some figures the other day. In 2020, the United States had a quota for refugees of 16,000 people. They only took in 11,000 the whole year. And now we've changed that, and we think it's wonderful because we have raised it to 62,500. The country that we will take refugees in a year, the country of Poland has taken millions of refugees. The population of Poland is 8% higher than it was before the Ukrainian war because of the amount of refugees that they've taken. France has taken over 1 million refugees, and we pat ourselves on the back because we are willing to raise our quota from 15,000 to 62,000. So the best version of ourselves is not only for us as individuals, but I think it does involve our church and our community. And we don't want to go looking for a church that will tell us it's okay to be anti-Semitic. It's okay to say we need a wall at our borders to keep people out. It's okay, but this is okay for us to be that version of ourselves. But there is a comfort in being convinced that you are doing all right if you feel this way, if you have this nature, this dislike, and so forth. So that's a particular point that I wanted to make that had to do with what Mary Beth said, because I know for all of us, we read these verses that call us to another dimension of service and we question just exactly to what extent we need to go. But I think that in Luke especially, the compassion to me draws me to thinking that that's a big part of it. To be a compassionate person, to be a person that really has empathy for people that are less fortunate, and then have the courage to act on it. Sylvia Campbell sent me a picture yesterday of her group of people helping the homeless downtown and preparing coffee for them and whatnot. And so I sent her back this very verse that we just talked about that says, where Jesus said, if you could help me if you wish, and he said, I'm willing. If you were willing, he said, I am willing. So I said, you're willing. She's willing. So that's to the pretty much at the end of what I had. Is any comments or questions or anything that?
Paul,
Yes.
you were talking about anti-Semitism and saying that some people had the impression as they got further in the Bible, beyond there's 3 books, it tended that way. Well, we spent about a year in this class, the book of John, which was by popular impression considered to be have this flavor to it. But reading through it at the time, the term the Jews primarily was referring to the Pharisees and the governance structure. I mean, the Herods were all Jewish, and at least one of them grew up in Roman court. And it wasn't even clear that they could speak the local languages. And, every year we have Palm Sunday, where the masses are applauding Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And then a week later, quote, the Jews executed him. Now, I can't believe that the masses were behind that. There's no clue to that. It's always the Pharisees and the the structure here in the Roman structure that, to me, were referred to in that. Now, I haven't read the whole business from anything like an analytic perspective, but I personally, from what I've been able to observe, I don't think that the Bible becomes, quote, anti-Semitic, which the word Semitic, by the way, has got nothing really to do with Jewishness. It's a linguistic term. And so I don't even think we should use that term. But anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah, well, that's a well-taken comment. I think that a lot of what I would say the anti-Jewish flavor came about with when Christianity spread beyond the Jewish community as to the conflict between whether to continue with Jewish rituals and circumcision and things like that, and the arguments that ensued over that, it became to be a big part of it.
This is true, but Jesus was nothing if he wasn't a good Jew.
Well, that's for sure. That
That's
is
absolutely
true.
And I will be addressing this issue next week in my class on John. Not that I'm going to resolve it, but I'm going to address that very issue.
You know, we're getting to running out of time here, and I want to close this with a little prayer. But first, I'd like to ask, today's Will's last day.
Yeah, where is he?
He's
Will, would you put yourself on the screen?
Me want to see you, Will.
And I'm hopeful and prayerful that he will join with us as much as possible. But so, Pastor, would you just make some comment about our love and
Yes.
appreciation for this man?
Let me lead into it, what may sound like a strange way. When I was in seminary, The Sound of Music came out. Sybil and I went to the Fox Theater to watch it. I was captivated by a song early on, How Do You Solve a Problem Like Maria? Where these nuns are trying to deal with this creature. And I love several of the lines. How do you catch a cloud and pin it down? How do you keep a wave upon the sand? How do you hold a moonbeam in your hand? I take that as imagery that people, all of us, but especially the Will Wellmans of this world, you can't encapsulate them. You can't capture them. Will's training in ecology and theology, and I've had my personal conversations with Will. I'm in the fourth quarter of my life. I recently celebrated my 81st birthday. As an old warhorse out to pasture, I'm glad there are people like Will Wellman coming behind me. That's the future of the church. We need not worry about the future of the church. And so Paul gave me an impossible task. I can't say enough. I can't hold this moonbeam in my hand, but Will, you know we love you. You have made a great impact on this community. In all my years, this is the most well-organized adult Christian education I've ever experienced, including the churches that I led. And we were conscientious, but Will has taken us to a whole new level. And we will miss you. We will continue to love you. And we will welcome any contact we can have with you, Will. You're a winner.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. Thank y'all. This is it's a bittersweet moment, but I'm grateful, and the adult education program strong because of y'all's participation. I just kind of made space for it.
Thank you, Will.
Let me close this with a short prayer. Dear God, as we try to be followers of the gospel, we are naturally called to study and learn more about these historical times and the recording of your holy word. We ask that you do not consider these efforts as our searching for reasons to bolster our faith in your promise that you will gather us all unto yourself. The grace and mercy that you continue to show us and the actual experience of your presence in our lives is ever sufficient for our faith and the promise of your righteousness. We would also like to thank you for the blessing that Will has been to this church and to each and every one of us here today, and we pray that you continue to use him in our service. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you.